Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today, what I wanted to do is go through all of the cluster jewel information that has been revealed so far about the new jewels that are being added in the Delirium expansion in 3.10 next week, and try to work out as much as possible about how these things work and how they're crafted. Now, I will say straight up that this is going to be speculation. I have no inside information. The only thing that I've got to go off is informed speculation based upon the publicly available information about what cluster jewels are added into the game. So with that in mind, each of the jewels has an enchant. Now, these enchants are this light text here. It's the same color as a Labyrinth enchant, the same color as a Blight oil upgrade on either a ring or a Blight oil anointment on an amulet. And these essentially define what the jewel does. It's been said that these cannot be changed by any means. So this medium cluster jewel here, no matter what you do to it in terms of crafting with it, it's always going to have adds 5 passive skills and adds small passive skills grant 10% increased damage while affected by a herald. Now, so each jewel has an enchant. This sets the number of nodes and the effect of small passives. Every teased jewel has considerable synergy between any notables that are on it, so in this case Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, and the small passives. Added small passives grant 10% increased damage while affected by a herald. Now, I suspect that this means the enchant strongly constrains what can roll. So for instance, if you were to have this cluster jewel here, the one that adds 5 passives and small passives grant 10% increased damage while affected by a herald, then the only notables you could get on it would be ones that relate to heralds in some way or that are jewel sockets. That's what I suspect. And you'll also be able to get things that augment the small nodes. You'll be able to get mods that do that. But that's my belief as to exactly how they work. Furthermore, we know that small cluster jewels can have 3 passives added onto the tree. We don't know whether they can have fewer or more than that. We've got examples of mediums adding 5 and of adding 6. So if we go down here, this one adds 6 and this one adds 5. And if we have a look at larges, we have as many as 12 passive skills being added, and we also have as few as 8. And here's the example that has exactly 8. I think in general that the smaller this number is, the more powerful a jewel is going to be. And that's because whilst you can juice up these small nodes considerably, as you see a good example of here, where each of these small nodes grants 1% chance to block attack damage, 8% chaos resistance, 5% increased damage, and 13 flat life. This is still not an extraordinary passive node. It's a reasonable one, but it's a reasonable one that comes at a high opportunity cost. So that's the first thing that I want to point out, that the less of these small nodes, the better in general. However, it may be the case that the number of passive nodes is absolutely inextricably linked to what the small passives grant and to what special nodes can roll. If that's the case, as for instance with this Soulless jewel here, maybe it's a case that you can only get Feasting Fiends and Skeletal Atrophy and Vicious Bite if you're on an 11 passive skill jewel. That we don't have enough information to say either way. Additionally, we've seen that medium jewels can have jewel sockets in them. So a cluster of jewels that are around a medium jewel can have a jewel socket in them, but as far as we know, these cannot have a large cluster jewel or a medium cluster jewel put in them. Only a small cluster jewel, a regular jewel, or an abyss jewel. And the large clusters, so the jewel sockets that are added by a large cluster, can have a medium cluster jewel, a small cluster jewel, or a regular jewel or an abyss jewel, to the best of our knowledge so far. We're going to have to test that out in practice when we get access to these jewels, which will probably be fairly early in Delirium. The last thing that I want to add is that the only example of a small cluster jewel that we have has minimum level 67. This is an interesting point, and it makes me think that one or two things is the case. Either small cluster jewels are endgame loot, or this specific jewel has very high tiers of rolls. So let's have a look at how minimum levels work in Path of Exile. Minimum levels are set by two different factors. The first one is that you get one minimum level from the minimum item level that the base item could drop from. So, for example, Crystal Belt, for the best from my recollection, is a minimum level of 80. Likewise, Opal Ring, likewise, Steel Ring. These are minimum level 80 items. Might actually be wrong on Crystal Belts, they might be a little bit lower. But let's just assume that they're 80. This is the lowest item level at which you can get these base types. Two-tone boots are a bit lower, they're 70. Glorious Plate is 68, and so on. That sets one minimum level on the item. The second minimum level that's set is based upon 80% of the lowest item level that could roll all of the explicit mods on that item. So to explain that in practice, you might know if you've ever crafted boots that you need to have a set of boots that are item level 86 or higher in order to roll the mod Hellions, which is 35% increased move speed. So if you have a boot that has Hellions on it, the minimum level that is imposed by the mod Hellions is 80% of 86, rounded down. And that 80% of 86 is 68.8, which rounds down to 68. And so this means that no matter what the base is, even if it was a set of wool shoes, which are one of the bases that you can get as early as the Twilight Strand, the minimum level on that item would be set to 68 by the Hellions mod. So, there is something about this Empyrean Bliss small cluster jewel that makes it minimum level 67. It is my expectation, and I could very well be wrong here, but it is my suspicion that the reason that this is item level 67 is because it is a small cluster jewel, and that is inherent to the base. That you're only going to find these in maps, and that they're an endgame little extra extension on the cluster jewel system. I think this would work because the small cluster jewels have the most potential to be extraordinary, but also they probably have their own special passive skills. One with the shield recovering 50 flat life when you block is a pretty unique effect. It's something that would be absolutely and utterly broken earlier in the game. Now, of course, that doesn't matter for an in-game player's perspective because we're generally pretty confident with pushing through the early level content. But it is generally the case that any mod that is extraordinarily overpowered when you get it does tend to have a fairly high minimum level on it. So for that reason, I kind of think that one with the shield might be the reason that the fact that this is a small cluster jewel might be the reason it's minimum level 67, and that one with the shield is gated behind having one of these specific jewels for that reason. Of course, it could be the case that this flat life roll or that this chaos resistance roll are rolls that only appear on items that are item level 84 or higher. There's precedent for that on Abyss Jewels. There are several mods on Abyss Jewels that only roll on item level 84 and up, and one of them is tier 1 chaos damage for whatever type of attacks the Abyss Jewel is for. So, for instance, tier 1 added chaos damage to wands, which isn't a very popular roll usually, but it is one that I believe is item level 84 required, which would then impose a minimum level of 67 on the item as a whole. So, my speculation on these items. Firstly, there's been a lot of questioning about whether the notable passives, we see these examples where all of the examples of magic items that we've got are one mod cluster jewels, and the added passive is a prefix. So here, notable medium cluster jewel. One added passive is fasting. This is an explicit mod because it's a magic item and it is a prefix. It is notable. Likewise, this touch of cruelty is an explicit mod and a prefix, and this overshock is a prefix, and cry wolf is a prefix, and also self-fulfilling prophecy, which is probably the most exciting of all of these nodes. That's also a prefix. So this led a lot of people to come to the conclusion that maybe all of the notables that can be added are prefixes. Then we got something that threw a spanner in the works, and that was this example that has three things that would then probably be assumed to be suffixes. You've got chaos resistance, fire resistance, and flat life nodes. And then you've also got this added passive skill of low tolerance. So low tolerance would be a prefix. Surely the other three are all suffixes, but is that right? Do we have a duel that can accept one prefix and three suffixes? And then we had Bramble Shard thrown in to really confuse things. Bramble Shard has two prefixes and then two dual sockets, which might be suffixes or prefixes, if we assume that all of the added passive notables are prefixes. But then, so that all seems to be really confusing. We've got two prefixes and two suffixes here. And then we had Soul Bliss come out, which was three notable prefixes. So, my expectation is that actually we were wrong when we early on thought, from all of those magic jewels, that that notables are always prefixes. I think we were wrong. What I think is the case is that these jewels obey the same two prefix and two suffix rules as normal jewels. However, some notables are prefixes and some notables are suffixes. It's just coincidence that we were given all of these as prefixes earlier on. Now, dual sockets will be similar. It's been stated that large clusters can't contain large jewels, mediums can't contain large or medium to keep these from being a total clusterfuck. Sorry about the pun. But I suspect that dual sockets might be available as prefixes or as suffixes, or maybe even as both. It may be that you can get one prefix and one suffix dual socket, as is seen here on Bramble Shard, and that there's the ability to have one of them as a prefix, one as a suffix, and the ability to get two notables as well, or to get all sorts of other things. Now, there are also prefixes and suffixes in the pool that don't add a notable, but instead modify the small nodes. And you see plenty of examples of those, but the most impressive of them is Empyrean Bliss here, where the added small passives grant 8% chaos res, 5% damage, and 13% maximum life. Essentially what we've got here, as well as the 1% chance to block that they already had. What you can think of this as is that this big node here, and just imagine that these were still 1% chance to block attack damage, but then all of these effects are doubled and added to the big node. Or you can think of them as being added to the dual slot. These look like they're really powerful, and I believe that they can be prefixes and suffixes as well. So what does this mean in terms of actually crafting with these things? Well, firstly, we don't know what fossils are going to do on these. It's my speculation that fossils will have exactly the same effect on these cluster jewels as they do on regular jewels, which means that they bias the roll pool towards specific types of rolls. So for instance, if you were to use a corroded fossil, then that would mean that of all of the possible passive skill modifiers you could roll, and of all of the possible notables you could roll, the ones that are linked to either poison or bleeding will become 10 times more common. The ones that are linked to elements will be completely removed from the roll pool. But this is my speculation here. Additionally, I'm also speculating that you will still receive the same additional mods that a corroded fossil can normally put onto an item. So the most important of these is actually the Aberrant Fossil, where there is a powerful chaos damage roll that you can get that is Aberrant Fossil exclusive. It stacks with the chaos damage roll that is in the normal roll pool. And so this is something I love doing at the start of a league. You know, when people are trying to gear up their Essence Train characters, I'll be out there buying as many Aberrant Fossils as I can and using them on Cobalt jewels and Viridian jewels in order to try and craft some really nice starter jewels for people who are running that exact setup. Now, if I'm right, then using an Aberrant Fossil will sometimes mean that one of these mods will be replaced by the Aberrant Fossil exclusive chaos damage roll, and then you'll still have your 2 or 3 other mods, as is normal for a rare jewel. You'll get a total of 3 or a total of 4. You'll have 2 or 3 other mods which will then be able to be anything from the pool of what that cluster jewel could roll. Of course, it's entirely possible that GGG might surprise us and might put some notables that are only available by the use of rolling these jewels with fossils. We're going to have to figure that out ourselves. Additionally, this is going to be a league where exalting jewels is going to be really, really, really good. Now, you don't actually need to use an exalted orb to do this. You can add a new mod onto an existing rare item using the betrayal system. If you can get Leo into the research division, rank him up to level 3, and then raid a research safe house, then Leo's crafting bench will allow you to mimic the effects of an exalted orb on an item. It's not as good as actually looting an exalt because you don't have all of the other functions that you can use an exalted orb on. So you can't trade it with other players the way that you can a normal exalted orb that drops for you in a map. You also can't use it to pay for Helena's bench crafting fees or Jun's bench crafting fees, which of course are actually some of the main uses for exalted orbs for very experienced players. However, Leo's bench is really good, and I think you're going to want to really use it in this league. So let's just say that you owned Empyrean Bliss, except it didn't have this small passive skills also grant 5% increased damage. So it was 8% chaos resistance on the small nodes, 13 flat life on the small nodes, and 1 with the shield. And you were playing a build that benefited from all these stats, so you were quite happy using it. Then you come along and you go, oh well, you know what, I'm going to Leo Exalt this, and suddenly you've got an extra 10% damage. That is a real improvement to a jewel. So for that reason, I think that all of the information we've got so far on cluster jewels points towards exalted orbs being really good. The other thing that's worth thinking of is that we're going to want 4 mod jewels more than usual. There is just so much power in these extra mods. At the moment, a 3 mod jewel can be really good if those 3 mods are synergistic. Obviously, adding a 4th mod makes it better, but it may not be worth the opportunity cost of hitting it with an exalted orb. One thing that's important to note is that when you roll a jewel using a Chaos Orb, a Fossil, or an Alchemy Orb, it seems to be, and this is from experimental data only and not a large enough sample size to be absolutely sure, but it seems to be that you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting 4 mods and a 2 in 3 chance of getting 3 mods. So most of the jewels you roll will be 3 mods, but some of them will be 4. If this is correct, it's going to mean that you're going to want to use a lot of potentially Chaos Orbs, potentially other currencies, more so than necessarily than using Transmute, Alteration, Regal method of crafting. All of this, though, again, is speculation. We need to see how big the pool is of added notable passives that can roll on any given that can roll attached to any given small passive mod. So to any given enchant, basically. So for instance, if you were to own a large cluster jewel with 11 passives and added small passives grant minions gain 10% increased damage, are you at all capable of rolling one additional passive skill is Blood Scent? Now there's no synergy between this minion mod and Blood Scent, so this would actually be quite detrimental if you can roll it. We're going to have to find out how that works because that's going to impact crafting a lot. And the only way we're going to do that is through trial and error and testing. Anyways, that hopefully gives a bit of a sense of what's known so far and what we can tease out from it. So my speculation is the jewels obey the same 2 prefix and 2 suffix rules as normal jewels. Some notables are prefixes, some of them are suffixes. Jewel sockets can either be prefixes or suffixes, and we're just going to have to figure that out. And that there will be prefixes and suffixes in the pool that add notables, that don't add notables but modify small nodes, will often be quite good and will be worth trying to exalt a jewel in order to get. Anyways, if you've got any comments or questions, fire away. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you have a good one.